Hello and welcome again to TelecomTV. We're on the road. We are at the SDN OpenFlow World Congress in Dusseldorf in Germany. I'm Martin Warwick and I'm talking with Matt Davey, who is the co-founder and principal solutions architect for Tallac Networks. Matt, you're very welcome. Based in Indiana.
Yes.
Not the first place that comes to mind for high-tech solutions, so I'm very glad to meet somebody from the Midlands, the heartland as it were, who's doing cutting-edge stuff.
Yes.
So let's start here. There's a lot of talk about managed LAN services through the cloud and the difficulties and the problems of orchestrating that. How do you do it? That's what you're involved in.
That's exactly what we're involved in. So we see a lot of customers wanting to get out of the business of managing their LANs, right? Particularly in small, medium enterprise space. So what we do, we have an SDN solution. We have a controller that runs in the cloud, controls all the APs and soon to be the switches in the LAN. It presents really an API on top of that, and that's really what the service providers like about the ability to then integrate that and orchestrate those managed LANs. So if you want to scale that up to hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of managed LANs, you have this ability with SDN to have an open API and an interface to automate and scale that up.
There's a lot of emphasis at the show here in Dusseldorf on proofs of concept, and there are outside this room and in the areas around there are 14 different ones, all working properly as they should do as proofs of concept. I know you're not involved in any of those, but outside in the larger world you are. What kind of POCs are you involved with?
So we have PLCs in a number of different verticals. We actually have production customers with these solutions in a number of different verticals. Hospitality being one of them, so service providers coming in and do Wi-Fi in hotels. A lot of interest in deploying in those spaces, as well as branch office. Companies that have 5, 10 offices, maybe not on the same carrier network where they couldn't do an MPLS VPN kind of solution, being able to manage the LAN and then provide virtual services, virtual network functions on top of that becomes very interesting in those markets. So we have production deployments in both of those verticals.
Thank you. Now look, whatever happens in other parts of a telco's business, arguably, probably certainly, access will still remain the most important part of it. How do you envisage that the access network will evolve by exploiting SDN and NFV?
But I think the key piece is the access layer is going to extend. I think a lot of carriers think of the access layer as ending at the CPE today. So one, I think that's going to extend. Clearly they're going to want to move in, get additional revenue out of managing the LAN component of that. And once they have that component that's really the touch point at the edge. If you think about cellular, right, and the carriers using cellular, they go all the way down to that wireless link out to the device. And frequent, today, more and more of them want to get into the Wi-Fi space and manage that Wi-Fi piece. To do that, they have to go past the edge of the customer prem and go further down into that network. So to me, the access layer is going to go all the way down to that RF hop, which is Wi-Fi in this case, inside the LAN. So I think that's one big piece. The other piece is once you start doing that, you don't want to have to roll trucks to put new devices out there. So this is the move to NFV. I want to move those services that would normally sit at that gateway function at the CPE and move those back into the cloud, back into their data center, so I can more scalably serve that and then increase the number of services I can deploy to them. So if I want to build another revenue generating service, I don't have to roll a truck to do that.
I know your principal focus presently is in SDN. NFV is held up in general as being the technology that appeals most obviously to the carrier community. But we've seen, and there's been talk here at the event about SDN being perhaps a Cinderella part of the whole of the two technologies, perhaps not as much emphasis on it as perhaps there ought to be. But now, talking to a few people, carriers seem suddenly to have woken up to the fact that SDN and NFV do in fact run in parallel. And SDN has real application for them. Do you agree with that?
I absolutely agree with that, and I think if you look in the data center where SDN started, particularly OpenFlow, a part of SDN started, it was all about pushing that SDN to the edge, to the hypervisor switch, the nearest thing to the user in the data center context. And so as we talk to a lot of carriers about this, they become very interested because that Wi-Fi access point at the true edge of the network is the right place to implement that. And you look at that kind of rich policy you can put in for subscribers at the edge. If I want to rate limit a subscriber down to a certain amount or change their QoS, you have to do that at the edge of the RF. And that's the Wi-Fi access point. So I think that's the interest we're seeing in carriers and going to that space. Once you have SDN there, it makes it really easy to start inserting services on a per user basis from the edge. One user could come back and get one service back in the core. A different user on the same Wi-Fi access point could get a completely different service. So I think that's the tie I see of those two things together.
And that capability has suddenly become more evident to the carriers, or what?
Yeah, I think it has. It hasn't been there. We get a lot of people coming to us and we got people thinking about how to do SDN with Wi-Fi, but we don't see anyone actually doing it except for you. Can we sit down and talk about how this is going to look? So I think they're all starting to think about it and looking for the solutions that are out there.
Thank you. Let's move on, finally, but for a few minutes, to talk about some nitty-gritty technology by way of a change. You know and I know that in this industry, acrostics, anagrams, initials, nicknames, a whole lot proliferate all over the place. There are just so many of them. And some we get used to and incorporate in our daily speech, and others we ignore or don't understand what they're about in the first place. Right? Now what's happened, I think, particularly is this massive cauldron of alphabet soup boiling away around virtual CPE functionality. And I'd like you to lead us gently down the path of explaining what some of this means. So everything these days for this is prefaced with a lowercase v, virtualized, virtualization, whatever it may be. But what about this thing called CGN and CGNAT? Doesn't really roll off the tongue, but carrier grade network address translation. Why is it important and what's it about?
Yeah, so there's so many subscribers in a carrier, right, that you have to do very large network address translation. Everyone gets a private address, and you can have thousands upon thousands of users that you need to do that network address translation for. And so you need a kind of specialized device to do that large scale network and translation of all your users to get them out to the public internet. So the key is then virtualizing that and getting rid of an appliance.
Right, that was very clear. I understand that one. Let's try our luck for another one. DHCP, Virtual Dynamic Host Configuration Protocol. Again, what is it and why is it suddenly important now?
Yeah, so every user that comes onto the network needs to get an address. The typical way to do that address is get it dynamically through a service called DHCP. So in our case, when you're looking at a managed LAN service, you have a bunch of users coming onto a Wi-Fi network. They all need to get an IP address from somewhere. Typically, that would live in a hardware appliance at the user site, a server or some sort of appliance that they would put out there. So moving that back into the cloud and serving all those addresses. So that's sort of the first step, is to give you address, and then they're going to have to translate that with the carrier grade NAT out to the internet.
Finally then, let's make it 3 out of 3. VBNG, I want to say Bing, but it's not obviously, but VBNG, Virtual Broadband Network Gateway. It's pretty evident in the giveaways in the last word, but just run us through that and explain it.
Yeah, so when you have a broadband connection, you're going to have typically a box. Sometimes it has Wi-Fi in it. That's going to do that translation from Ethernet out to your DSL or your cable modem, or whatever the provider is coming in with. It's a hardware box. And so taking those functions, which is typically routing, maybe it includes a network translation. It could include DHCP, and moving all those functions then back into the cloud. So no longer you just have a layer 2, maybe an Ethernet connection, just straight through out your house or whatever to the carrier, and then all those functions get moved back. Again, not another device to support on site. It's all software running back in the data center.
Thanks, Matt. That's really cleared things up. And there are very few people who can just sit there and do what you've just done, believe you me. So well done for that. The last question to you is, let's look forward a year or so. We've seen SDN and FV come from nowhere in 2 years. Obviously massively important, structurally, organizationally, technologically as well. Where do you think we're going to be in a year's time? I take it we'll be in another German town at the 4th iteration.
Yes.
of this. What do you think the emphasis is going to be on, and what will have been achieved over the next 12 months?
I think you're going to see real production deployments starting to scale up. I mean, we see this from a number of the carriers that we're working with that are going to be rolling things into production customer-facing services in the next 12 months. So I think what I think we'll see is people coming back and saying, we did this on this scale, and this is what we learned by doing it, as opposed to talking in proof of concepts, we actually put it into production.
Well, let's hope we meet again the same time next year. Until then, and anyway, Matt Davey, thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.